Okay then, ladies and gentlemen, so today our subject is the working class and orthodoxy. So those of you who can remember back to our first two lectures at the beginning of the course, we covered the growing industrialization and urbanization of the Russian Empire in its last few decades. So roughly from about the 1880s until 1917. And it was, in doing so, it was following generally established patterns occurring elsewhere in Europe. The generally established patterns that had been set during the Industrial Revolution in Great Britain, where mass factory production and the transformation of cities into growing hubs of employment had led to a fundamental transformation, not only in terms of technology, but also in terms of social life, culture, and indeed most other aspects of human existence. That is why we call it an industrial revolution. It didn't simply affect economic behaviors, economic life, but all spheres of human existence. And we're going to see today precisely how the Russian Orthodox Church and Russian Orthodox believers react and change with the emergence, with the increasing urbanization and industrialization of Russia. Now, I've drawn most of the examples that we're going to discuss today from St. Petersburg, for the simple reason that it is the most well-studied case. Although I think what we say here can also be broadly said of events going on in Moscow, in places in the Urals, in other industrializing cities like Odessa, Warsaw, Lvov, Riga. So what we're going to discuss has general applicability throughout the Russian Empire. So, to begin, but before we get to that, I want to give you some conceptual overviews. Some of the major debates that you can see happening in not just the field of Russian religious history, but I would say religious history and indeed the study of religion overall as a subject. And this is what we have come to know as, following the German sociologist Max Weber's phrase, the disenchantment of the world. This idea, as we're going to see, had great purchase throughout a great deal of the late 19th and much of the 20th century, although it has in recent decades been subjected to increasing challenge. So, the term you're going to find in your reading is this notion of secularization and the secularization thesis. Now, I've used secularization in one sense before in this lecture series, and that is to refer to the secularization of church land. That is to say, the seizure of church land by the state. Here we use it in its more modern sense, to mean the increasing, let's say, exclusion of religion and of religious organizations from social, public, and political life. The secularization thesis, as an argument, held great sway over the majority of academics from much of the 20th century. And to give it very basically, secularization thesis argues thus, that basically as the conditions of modernity increase, religiosity declines. Now, of course, what do we need to ask several questions here. What do we mean by conditions of modernity? Well, you can say, for instance, we could talk about many fundamental facts, such as increasing life expectancy, increased standards of living, greater shares of the wealth, new technology, increased education, an expansion of scientific knowledge about the physical world, the emergence of new regimes, not necessarily reliant on either church support or a sacralization of political ideas and ideologies. Decline things such as equally, we might discuss the changing position of women in the workplace, new ideas about human rights, new regimes emerging around around ideas of democracy. These are a broad group of things generally which academics term conditions of modernity. Now, the secularization thesis has appeared in the works of many writers and many famous philosophers in many different terms. So, for instance, in the work of Karl Marx, religion is part of a superstructure connected to a religious, connected to a socio-economic foundation. And Marx's argument was when the socio-economic foundation changes, well, the superstructure, including religion, I mean, superstructure can be other things such as culture, various cultural phenomena, including religion. But as the foundation changed, the superstructure also changed. And Marx's sort of argument was that basically religion existed in a capitalist order, largely as a painkiller, as an opiate, as he put it, that enabled the working class to accept their condition in what he called in a otherwise bleak and harsh existence. So he called the religion, for instance, the heart of a heartless world. For Marx, his basic idea was that once you had established a more equal, a fairer regime dominated by the proletariat, which you established a foundation dominated by the proletariat owning the means of production. That is the key factor of economic and therefore social political control. Religion itself would enter into a decline. Now, Marx, the Marxist vision of the secularization theory went on to be extremely influential, of course, in the Soviet Union, but also broadly beyond. The idea that precisely religion is expected to decline once a new, more equitable social economic order emerges. Now, to take a different perspective, we have the German sociologist I mentioned before, Max Weber. And for Max Weber, he focused more on ideas of the rationalization of life, on the increasing bureaucratization of life and society, as a turn away from mystical explanations mystical explanations of the world, of phenomena, and of society as a whole. And these had led this rationalization of life, this bureaucratization of life and the social order, in Weber's view, had led to driving out previous ideas, previous beliefs based in religion from political, public, social life. So in other words, to put it very, very crudely, Weber's idea is that as scientific knowledge, as greater scientific knowledge, education, more sophisticated mechanisms of governance increase, religion and mystical explanations increasingly find themselves driven to the boundaries of social life. In other words, both of these ideas hold that the decline of religion is an inevitable consequence of the development of certain conditions of modernity, whether it be rationalization in Weber's view or the emergence of a more equitable ownership of the means of production in Karl Marx's view. Now, in the West, this secularization thesis rose greatly to prominence, especially among American academics, working from about the interwar period until about the 1970s. At the time, it could be said to make a great deal of sense. It did appear, to a large extent, that the kind of religious regimes, or at least religiously supported regimes, the confessional states that had dominated the world in the 18th and 19th century, were very definitely on the retreat in the post-World War II period. It can be said increasingly that religious behaviors were somewhat in retreat in much of the industrialized Western world. An ever-increasing number of Western states had basically created a secular regime with church and state divided, with the state acting as a supposedly neutral umpire between various confessions, while also guaranteeing each citizen the right to freedom of religious confession and freedom of conscience. Increasingly, it was believed that religious belief was being driven from the public world and into the private. And it was largely being driven, so it was held, by changing material conditions associated strongly with the modern era. However, in the 1980s, it became clear to most that this, in its crudest form at least, the secularization thesis was becoming untenable. In the Middle East, for example, an Islamic revolution overthrew the Shah and created an official Islamic republic. In America, evangelical Christians organized and became a political force which was largely responsible for the election of Ronald Reagan and his Republicans in the early 1980s. Elsewhere in the world, religion was clearly still a factor. Northern Ireland still was seeing recurrent violence between Protestant and Catholic communities. And when the Iron Curtain fell and the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact states fell apart, religion emerged very strongly in these new states, particularly in Poland, where the Catholic Church did, and to an extent does, played a large public role in politics, society, and culture. The same is true to an extent in Russia after the Soviet Union, where the Orthodox Church and Orthodox beliefs, Orthodox habits, Orthodox rituals returned strongly following the collapse of the Soviet Union. And then finally, the attacks on the World Trade Center in 2001 marked the rise of an Islamic-inspired form of terrorism, thus marked the rise of an Islamic form of terrorism, a problem which is still being dealt with by states and societies today. And my point is, by bringing up all these examples of how religion still influences the modern world, politically, socially, culturally, and economically, is that it was clear that the secularization thesis had made some fundamental errors. Clearly, there is not a direct trend, a direct connection, or at least not an uncomplicated direct connection between the developments of the conditions of modernity and the decline of religiosity. Clearly, religion still has a substantial role to play in the culture of the modern industrialized world. It is generating political movements, new forms of worship and behavior, influential institutions, and indeed, unfortunately, terrible acts of violence, war, and terrorism across the world today. And of course, this meant that sociologists, historians, anthropologists, the entire group of academics, the groups of academics who had previously so strongly supported the secularization thesis, had to start to look again at the underlying assumptions of the secularization thesis. So for instance, let's say so in its very crudest form, we say, religion declines as the conditions of modernity increase. What do we mean then by religion in this context? Well, surprisingly, this didn't really occur to many of the academics in the sort of heyday of the secularization thesis. It didn't really occur to them to define what they meant by religion. And therefore, if there was no definition of religion, how could you measure if it declined or it increased? It's quite a difficult question, I think. Do we define religion by, for instance, do we define, let's say, Catholic religion by people attending Mass, the Eucharist? Do we define it by people putting that label, self-defining as that on the census? Are there any other metrics we can use? How do we tell that religion or Christianity or whatever sort of spiritual force is in decline? I mean, it's a very hard question to ask, because you could also consider, for instance, biblical narratives or biblical narrative structures continue to influence, for instance, the narrative structures of films, television shows, book plots, etc., etc. That could be argued as a kind of religious influence. Now, some people say direct, oh, well, you can look at things like the number of people taking Eucharist in most Catholic or Orthodox countries. But as I'm going to show, as I spoke about in our last lecture, taking the Eucharist is not necessarily a measure of religious belief. Taking it frequently is not necessarily a measure of being a religious person. And say Imperial Russia, where people actually regarded taking the Eucharist and taking confession as a very serious thing that required serious preparation to do. And therefore they did so relatively seldom. And of course, there's the fact that taking the Eucharist and confession is required by law. So how in the Russian Empire? So how can you use that as a metric of religion, religiosity, popularity of religion it doesn't really work. And similarly, someone can put down on a census, I am a Protestant, I am an Orthodox, I am a Catholic. But that doesn't necessarily, that might be an idea of their identity, but it doesn't necessarily reflect, let's say, reflect religious behaviors. Or knowledge of the church's doctrine, or key aspects of the church's belief system. In other words, it is extremely hard to measure whether religion declines, it has declined, has increased. And this is one of the reasons why the secularization thesis ultimately ended up being quite so flawed. It never really attempted to reach a consensus on how to measure religion, and therefore could never really measure whether religion has historically increased or declined, let's say, between 1800 and the year 2000, or the year 1950. Historians, of course, generally, as a rule, did try to introduce a historical perspective to what was an overwhelmingly sociological and political science theory. And indeed, there are very prominent historians who not only question how one measures religion, but even the sort of time scale or the time frame of the general secularization thesis. So I've given you the examples here of two prominent British historians studying not Russian religion, but British religion in the 20th century, 19th and 20th centuries, Callum Brown and Hugh MacLeod, who both questioned the idea of sort of a gradual decline of religion as condition, which went sort of in sync as conditions of modernity increased. Indeed, what both historians ultimately identified was religion was in many cases relatively strong in Britain until the sexual revolutions and various sort of other cultural revolutions are associated with the 1960s caused a terminal decline. You can see why that doesn't necessarily agree with the secularization thesis, because the 1960s is quite a long way in to modernity. And yet religion had not seen a decline until that point, until some fundamental changes happened at that point. And after that point, indeed, religion went into absolutely sharp decline, to the point that Callum Brown named his book The Strange Death of Christian Britain. Now, why am I talking about this sort of theory in this lecture today? Well, basically, we are going into where we're going to look at is the industrialized cities of the late Russian Empire, arguably the most modern points of the most modern locations in the Russian Empire. And as such, it has generally been argued that religion played very little role or a declining role in these industrial modern sites. This was particularly underscored by the success of the Bolsheviks, largely riding on the support of working class Petersburgers and Muscovites in October 1917. And historians and various other commentators said, oh, well, look, the Bolsheviks had to win for some reason against the various forces arrayed against them, one of which, of course, was the Orthodox Church. Well, it must be because the cities were fundamentally a-religious or irreligious spaces. This was underscored repeatedly by the developments, especially in the Soviet Union, but also in the West, of a Marxist conceptual framework, which argued that the cities, as the most advanced socio-economic spaces of the Russian Empire, necessarily saw less religion. However, when historians, both Russian and Western, were allowed into the Russian archives following the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, when religion ceased to be a prohibited subject for historians after 1991. A vast new array of evidence has severely complicated and indeed perhaps even discredited this older picture of Russian cities as cauldrons of atheism and irreligion. Indeed, what I'm going to show you is a very nuanced picture of certainly problems, certainly infrastructural problems on the side of a church, certainly problems of authority on the side of a church, but also signs of quite strong religiosity among the urban working class in St. Petersburg, and definite attempts by the church and its personnel to reach out to that urban working class. This, by the way, connects somewhat to our earlier point a few lectures back about the sort of church as handmaiden of the state, but the church was purely a reactive institution who only sort of obeyed the demands of the state, when in fact it could be proactive and could try and launch its own policies, its own missions, which it certainly did in at least some of the cities of the Russian Empire, trying to make sure that some spiritual council and some church surveillance was present in these new hubs of modernity. But anyway, let's get on to now. Let's move away from this very abstract and conceptual discussion and move on to the concrete sort of situation. So again, I discussed this at some extent in lecture 2. I will go on again here. That the abolition of serfdom in 1861 was the major precondition for the establishment of, for the growth of industry and cities in the Russian Empire. One fact of the matter is they didn't, now that they were essentially free peasants, they didn't have to seek permission from landlords, etc., to go and move to a different place. They could do so relatively freely by applying for a passport. Meanwhile, there was also problems with the amount of land available for this newly free peasantry. Basically, the peasant population increased dramatically after the Great Reforms, but the land share of the peasants did not, and this meant there was less and less land available for supporting more and more peasants. Both these factors increased mobility, and the technologies of mobility as well, don't forget. Trains in particular, taking people from major cities, from dusty rural train stations to major cities. So you have increased rural mobility, combined with land hunger, combined with a situation of basically a increasing impoverishment of the villages. And this basically drives more and more peasants to migrate to the cities, even if only on a temporary basis, for seasonal work. So go to St. Petersburg, Moscow, wherever, in the winter, and then return home to the village where presumably your wife and children live in the summer to undertake the field work, by doing so providing your family with cash earned in the growing factories of St. Petersburg. Russian heavy industry feeding on this relatively cheap labor force and increasing international connections to the international market also exploded. And a major factor was when the finance minister Sergei Witte in the late 1890s transition Russia to the gold standard, thus making the ruble a far safer bet for foreign investors, making Russia a far safer place for foreign investors. This saw a boom, particularly in French, Belgium, German, British investment in Russian industry, leading to the massive increase in production of things such as iron, steel, coal, and other major resources required for the emerging industrialized world of late 19th century Europe. And of course, arriving in the cities, this new working class, we have to use the term somewhat carefully because, of course, these were peasants who had migrated to the cities, and whether we can term them truly as being truly working class is a sociological question often asked. But certainly there was an emerging smaller group of permanent workers alongside these seasonal migrants, and they all shared largely the same rather horrendous living conditions. Dangerous work which could either kill or seriously injure you, child labor, polluted streets, slum living with many people packed to a room, long working hours, extremely low wages, very little, if anything, in the way of security, social security. There was certainly very little in the way of things like pensions, national insurance if you were injured, or etc., etc. So certainly the conditions in these new metropolises were difficult for the working classes. And of course, this did not go unquestioned or unresisted. Workers did increasingly in the late 19th and early 20th century strike for the improvement of conditions. That is to say, they withdrew their labor, picketed various industries, various factories, in order to gain an improvement of their salaries, of their holidays, of their rights, of their benefits. And of course, in following the Bloody Sunday in January 1905, this led, the general strike declared, almost led to the overthrow of the Romanov dynasty in what is called today the First Russian Revolution. On this occasion, the Romanov dynasty was able to sort of offer enough benefits, offer enough concessions to construct a coalition around it and survive. But nonetheless, the workers were increasingly demonstrating their willingness to organize and consciousness of their interests and how best to secure those interests. Now, as this new working class and these migrational laborers came to the cities, they were increasingly confronted by a very different sort of world than that which had existed either in older towns or indeed especially in the countryside. In the countryside, especially, religious faith had in a certain sense been a form of entertainment. It had offered rituals, celebrations, communal celebrations joined by the entire village community. Its building offered a place of lights, of colour, amidst the world mostly consisting of very murky browns, the browns of mud, the grey of the sky, the dull green of the grass. priests had preached, often on popular subjects, especially towards the end of the 19th century. Orthodox churches often had small libraries for the literate among the peasants. In other words, Orthodoxy and its church in the village had offered a degree of entertainment on which it had almost something like a monopoly. Of course, there were other forms of popular entertainment, but certainly none enjoyed the mass institutional support that the Orthodox Church did. Now, this was completely different in the new industrialized cities, where there was an incredible array of activities for a person with a bit of free time and perhaps a small amount of money on their hands. Cinemas, theatres, all variety of shops, any variety of taverns, restaurants, ranging from the dingiest, the dingiest dive, all the way up to the richest, the most expensive establishments on Nevsky Prospect, brothels, tea houses, lectures, magic lantern shows. On offer in the cities is a huge range of entertainments for these new workers in the cities. And of course, any of these migrant labourers, many of these labourers, young men, young women also, away from any sort of constraining authority, might choose to use authority or guidance, might choose to use their newly earned cash salary, their cash wages, and their 1 or 2 days off a week to indulge precisely in these new temptations offered by urban life. This, of course, meant that the churches in the cities were facing, to some extent, a form of competition from these so-called frivolous urban attractions. Now, the churches, in many ways, did not start out from a good position in this competition with secular amusements. Expanding the network of churches in most urban contexts went extremely slowly, meaning that because of the extremely rapid rate of urbanization, the extremely rapid increases in the population, the church network was quickly outstripped. I've given you a couple of examples here. In St. Petersburg, the population more than doubles between 1881 and 1914. But yet, to deal with this from 860,000 to over 2 million. And yet, to deal with this huge new population, the church only managed to build 65 new churches to serve it. The situation was the same elsewhere. Chelyabinsk, a city in the Urals, for instance, had a population increase of 1 million in the space of about 3 decades. But yet still, the number of churches did not keep pace with the population growth. In part, this was due to the church's continued financial woes. From the late 18th century onwards, the church had been dependent on the state budget for its finances. And this money from the state did not allow for massive, ambitious programs of church construction, especially in the cities, where usually these churches would have to be built of stone, rather than wood because of fire regulations. And the expanding communities pose other challenges as well. Priests, as these migrant workers came in and came out, this meant that rather than a fixed group of believers whom the priest might have known for many, many, many years, there is a constantly fluctuating flock. It is hard, therefore, for the priests, for the church as a whole, to maintain supervision, surveillance, or offer spiritual counsel to this ever-changing, ever-shifting population of workers, of migrant workers coming in and out. So it would seem, at least in terms of its church network, the church was poorly equipped to handle the massive changes induced by urbanization. And furthermore, the church had a rather antiquated view on these new workers. Taking their sort of draw from certain nationalist philosophies, certain populist philosophies as well. The church argued that the countryside was the sort of repository of all good national values. The countryside was a healthy place, not just physically, but mentally and morally and spiritually. Certainly we can recognize, I think this is an ideology which is shared by many sort of national movements in Europe at the time, which is a contrast between the corruption of the city and the moral goodness of the countryside, of the health of the countryside. And certainly, in contrast, the church regarded the cities as corrupt, decadent, destructive, licentious places where all manners of terrible sins were going on. Given the church's views on the countryside and the city, how do you think the church looks at migrant labourers? Well, with a great deal of worry, because what the church sees is these honest, good sons of the peasantry going off to St. Petersburg and Moscow and wherever else, are entering into urban life and being corrupted by it. And while they're in this urban life, of course, the church is aware that it has very few mechanisms to monitor this relatively mobile labour force, and it has a poorly equipped church network to compete with these corrupt, licentious forms of entertainment available in the city. In other words, the church almost begins to conceive of its mission to the urban proletariat at the beginning of the 20th century as a campaign of re-Christianization, regarding that when these people made the move from the village, the pure, clean, moral, spiritual village, to the dirty, sinful city, they essentially lost their Christian faith. Now, of course, this isn't a particularly productive way to approach the problem of outreach to the urban working classes, because it basically regards the urban working classes as almost a lost peasantry, whose views, habits, customs, beliefs were still those of the peasantry, and were still rooted in the village. In other words, the church's this kind of conceptualization didn't really bear the interests of the newly emerging industrial classes industrial working classes in mind. Now, this problem of how to reach the new urban working classes had been encountered elsewhere in the industrializing Western world at this point, the end of the 19th, early 20th century. And in America in particular, an influential idea had emerged among Protestant, but also to a certain extent some Catholic groups, the idea of a social gospel. The social gospel was a response to the massive numbers of impoverished, suffering workers that had emerged out of the urbanizing cities. And the fundamental idea behind these social gospels, regardless of confession, was that churches and their personnel should be interested not simply in the next world, in offering people salvation after death, or salvation after the end of times, but rather these churches should strive to take care of the material needs of their flocks in the here and now. That they should try and improve conditions of health, try and improve education, try and improve the basic material needs of these new urban working classes. Now in Russia, it's not clear, of course, whether this was a direct influence from America, but certainly there was a form of Orthodox social gospel that emerged in St. Petersburg in about the mid 1880s. Now, some of you might recognize his portrait from 2 lectures ago when we spoke about Metropolitan Antony Vatkovsky. He was the Metropolitan of St. Petersburg from 1899, but previously, in the middle of the 1880s, had been the rector of the St. Petersburg Ecclesiastical Academy. And Antony, building to a certain extent on some previous figures within the Academy, but largely through his own interest in homiletics and in pastoral theology, pushed forward a notion of social gospel into the Academy. In other words, among the students of one of the leading centers of Orthodox education in the Russian Empire, filled with intelligent, ambitious, socially responsible young men who also sought careers in the church. Under his guidance, for instance, Antony pushed priests to go forth into the city, to organize lectures, conduct sermons, to organize charitable measures, to essentially try through every means available to them to reach out to the working class, to this new suffering working class. One of the bases that Antony was able to build on was the so-called Society for Moral and Religious Enlightenment, a lecture society. And basically what it sought to do was encourage interest in Orthodoxy by holding various lectures, by holding talks, by holding Bible readings, but not only on religion, but on sometimes and also, often on secular subjects, taught by priests and other church-associated individuals. Antony absolutely sponsored the students of his academy to go and speak in this society, which increased the numbers of lectures that were being held per week, allowing them to reach out to an ever-increasing number, and indeed drawing more and more people in. And they were a modest success. Reports from the 1890s suggest that there were hundreds of people generally attending each lecture. By 1906, this had become quite a sort of Goliath institution, with a huge network of libraries, lecture halls, schools, tea rooms, all of which offering workers a Orthodox alternative to the various secular delights in the city. However, we should make one note about this, is that Antoni Wadkowski, nor any other churchman, particularly played a leadership role within the society. In fact, it was dominated by the laity, and it certainly was not controlled by the synod, although it would be a mistake to say that neither the synod nor the clergy had no influence in the running of the society and its general direction. Another area where this new social gospel came to be of significant prominence was the church's temperance movement. Now, for a long time, the arguments had been circulating that alcoholism, especially the consumption of vodka, was the Russian national disease. Figures from the time don't really bear this out, but certainly it was the perception, not just in society, but in the state and the church, that religion presented alcohol presented a dire threat to Russian family life, to Russian economic life, to Russian social and cultural life. And so various groups, including the church, launched temperance missions against alcohol. Temperance, by the way, I mean a society dedicated to not drinking alcohol, to trying to coax people not to drink alcohol. Well, of course, you can imagine that to a certain extent in these new industrial cities, it was true that people may have been drinking rather significantly. These new working classes may have been drinking rather significantly. Imagine how dire the conditions were for most of them in their workplaces, in their homes, dirty, diseased, dangerous, full of death. I'm sure alcoholism was drinking alcohol was a fundamental release and form of entertainment for the new industrial working class. Here is one area where the church reacted very strongly, setting up temperance movements, not only in St. Petersburg, but across the Russian Empire. Giving you here 261 in the space of 11 years were created throughout the empire to try and tackle this problem of alcoholism, to tackle the problem of alcoholism and its social damage. The largest and probably the most prominent of these temperance societies was the Alexander Nevsky Temperance Society in St. Petersburg, which by now you can see a picture of one of their meetings here, and which by the revolution of 1905 had 95,000 members, an extremely large group by the standards of a relatively autonomous social institution. Yes, a relatively large number for a sort of autonomous social institution. Of course, we can't say how many people this society, it's very difficult to generalize and say, well, how many people gave up alcohol as a result of this society's influence? I mean, how many people truly kept by their promises to give up alcohol, etc., etc. It's very difficult to say. But certainly what this is proof of is that the church is making an effort to try and solve one of the material problems afflicting the Orthodox working class, particularly in St. Petersburg, but also in the other cities of the empire. we've now looked at sort of the basic approaches, basic problems of the church's approach to the urban working class, and also some of its more successful ventures, its attempts to create temperance societies, lecture societies, etc., to offer some kind of alternative to the sinful life of temptation present in the cities. Now I want to look at 3 cases of religious leaders and their movements in St. Petersburg. And to use these cases to show precisely how, firstly, there was a great deal of enthusiasm for these charismatic religious leaders. But that also the church, secondly, that the church sponsored these people, but to an extent. And that extent was the extent to which they challenged or did not challenge its own authority. This is something we saw in our last lecture, and it's going to be something we see elsewhere. The church had a paradoxical attitude. In many ways, it was eager to promote piety, religiosity, and their associated behaviors and beliefs among the peasantry, the working class, and other strata of Russian society. But on the other hand, it always feared that this piety, this religiosity would escape from its control. The synod was happy with religiosity if it could control it, and therefore prevent any social instability, any political incidents that might endanger the church's own position and the stability of the imperial state. So our first figure is, and certainly the most famous of the 3, is Ioann of Kronshtadt, otherwise known today in the Russian Orthodox Church as St Ioann Kronshtatsky, or St Ioann of Kronshtadt. So, as per usual for a priest in the Imperial Russia, he was the son of a clergyman, although the clergyman in question was not ordained, that is to say, he could not perform the sacraments. But despite his father's relatively lowly position in the church, he went along the usual route of church education, passing through the seminary, and finding the fact that he was passing through the church schools and the seminary. And upon conclusion of the seminary, he was able to graduate with exceptionally high grades, which, as per normal, allowed him to undertake higher education in the St. Petersburg Ecclesiastical Academy. Now, this was still some decades before Antony Vadkovsky's tenure. So this kind of focus on what I call the Orthodox social gospel was not yet present. But following his stay in the academy, he was then posted to one of St. Petersburg's poorest parishes, that of Kronstadt. It's an island. It's on the island of Kronstadt, largely made up of workers in the dockyards and the factories supplying the dockyards. And Ioann, even from the beginning, employed practices which at the time were considered highly unusual for an Orthodox priest. For instance, as I've noted, confession and the Eucharist, 2 sacraments, were legally required once a year. peasants and other people taking the sacraments took taking these very seriously, often engaging in long periods of purification before taking the sacrament once a year. Engaging in the fasts, not trying to act morally, not undertaking any sort of immoral conduct like drinking or sex or anything like this before taking the sacraments, etc., etc. Ioann, however, had a different view on the sacraments. He believed that a person should take them as frequently as possible. He believed that frequent taking of the sacraments would continually reconnect the believer with the Church, with the Orthodox faith, and revitalize their own belief. Ioann also adopted a very peculiar style of lecturing, of giving sermons. At the time, still many Orthodox priests, at least in parish churches, were not renowned for their good rhetorical style. Sermons, if they gave them at all, were rather dry, boring, plodding affairs. Ioann, both in his serving of the liturgy and in his sermons, brought a different approach. Energetic body movements, placing the stress on odd parts of a speech, speaking quickly and speaking slowly in rapid succession. This was quite a shock to his parishioners, who were drawn in to this new, unexpected style of sermonizing. Meanwhile, it should be emphasized that Ioann was also an immensely charitable man. His wife later complained that she was never able to keep any money to put aside for savings, because basically Ioann gave away everything he had as soon as he got it. If anyone came to him asking for money, he would basically give it. And certainly by the beginning of the 20th century, when Ioann was rich, was relatively famous, and was bringing in money from various different sources across the Russian Empire, he certainly was a major charitable benefactor of monasteries, churches, convents, various charitable and secular initiatives in the most distant parts of the Russian Empire. Again, to give you an example, Ioann was an active contributor to the development of Orthodoxy in Estonia. He repeatedly gave donations to the Puktitsa monastery, convent, for instance, repeatedly made visits there, and also donated money to the construction of the St Alexander Nevsky Cathedral in Tallinn. Ioann's innovative techniques, demanding frequent sacraments, demanding frequent taking of the sacrament, and an odd sermonizing liturgical style, combined with his own brand of personability, his own charisma, to leading to the expansion of his reputation far beyond the boundaries of his own parish. Indeed, it can probably be said by the 1880s, Ioann of Kronshtadt, Ioann Sigiev, has become the most famous priest in the Russian Empire, whose sermons could draw crowds of hundreds, if not thousands. While Ioann, of course, was also a remarkably good self-publicist, knowing precisely to get articles published about himself in cheap newspapers, to have cheap brochures about his life and times published. He certainly knew how to encourage his own reputation. And as he became more and more famous, a sort of cottage industry, a cottage souvenir industry grew up around Ioann, with his followers selling signatures, photographs, items that he had touched, postcards, etc., etc., etc. A variety of the usual kind of tourist hats, that you can find in various shops, to a ever-increasing market. Ioann was also regarded as being a spiritual elder. Now, you remember last lecture we talked about elderhood. Precisely, he is somebody who is regarded as a holy, pious, spiritual counselor, whose advice and forecasts carry a particular weight. And indeed, for those he accepts as his spiritual children, carry the weight of instructions that should be followed at all costs. Ioann, in distinction from many other elders of the time, however, often did his monitored and communicated with his spiritual children through letters or through the new technology of telegrams and so on and so forth, rather than personal communications. So Ioann's sort of cult of elderhood, if you like, benefited directly from the communications revolution, the revolution in communications infrastructure then going on inside the Russian Empire. And indeed, some of his liturgies were so popular that the size of the crowds were in fact dangerous. And there are some instances of people being crushed to death as they tried to squeeze in to Ioann's rather small parish church in Kronshtadt. So we've already discussed Ioann's sort of charitable giving away money, but of course, as he became more famous and gained access to more resources, both financial and human, he was able to sort of expand and institutionalize his charitable activities. So, for instance, I've given you here the example of, in 1882, Ioann setting up a house of industry, basically a place where unemployed workers could go both to seek shelter, also potentially to learn new skills, and hopefully be re-employed on the basis of their time in the shelter. And an entire panoply of charitable institutions also opens up around Ioann's school in Kronshtadt. School, hospital, library, homeless shelter, all of which intended to channel the relatively large amounts of money coming in now to Ioann to the Petersburg urban poor. Now, I have to emphasize just how popular Ioann was. I mean, it really was a nationwide cult, a nationwide craze about Father Ioann Sigiev. And like all such crazes, like all such cults, it started to produce people who went to extremes, in following this extremely charismatic priest. These were the so-called Ioannitsi, and the miraculous healings supposedly attributed to Ioann. Ioannitsi basically started to worship Ioann firstly as a living saint, but then reached ever increasing levels of extremity, finally with one of their leaders, Matriona Kisulova, declaring that Ioann was not just a saint, but was in fact was in fact God himself, come down upon the world. And the Ioannitsi ideas, feeding on the cult of Ioann of Kronshtadt, spread throughout Russia. And here we have the example of religious excitement in many ways, running out of the boundaries of control that the synod had set. Certainly, Ioann himself had absolutely no interest in supporting these individuals, never had made any claims either against the church or the state. He certainly never claimed to be God. I mean, Ioann was a sort of picture-perfect supporter of the imperial regime in its last few decades. I mean, he was an outright monarchist, a fairly pronounced anti-Semite, and deeply conservative. He certainly never harbored any desire to disrupt the social order or to spread religious ideas that might prove dangerous to either state, church, or society. Certainly at the time, the synod began to realize that the fame of Ioann was exceeding the boundaries that they had set, that Orthodox doctrine itself set. It was noted, for instance, people treated Ioann's postcards and photographs like icons. And of course, in the Orthodox Church, in the theology of the Orthodox Church, the only subject of an icon is a dead person. So, to rephrase that more elegantly, a dead person, in order to be a saint, you have to be dead, and saints have icons made of them. So, worshipping Ioann's photographs, Ioann, both someone who was living and had not been declared a saint at this point, at least, by the Orthodox Church, demonstrated that faith, that this piety ran the risk of flowing beyond the rather the doctrinal lines that the synod wished to uphold. And basically, when it came to Ioannitsi, the synod had absolutely no desire to deal with these individuals. From the synod's perspective, they were propagating a highly false, a highly erroneous, and a highly dangerous form of belief, which led to the synod throwing out these individuals from the church in 1912, having them declared a sect. And certainly the church, together with the state, pursued them as basically as fraudsters, as people using the reputation of Ioann to commit financial fraud and other kinds of fraud on susceptible, naive individuals. And just to note, Ioann publicly renounced these Ioannitsi, publicly renounced them and said that he had absolutely nothing to do with them, absolutely had no support for their position. Now, our second figure was a man known as Ivan, later known as Ioann, or brother Ioann Chulikov. And he, unlike Ioann, and unlike our third example, was not a priest. He was a peasant who originally came from Samara. And his origin story goes a little bit like this. Well, basically, he was a tavern owner who got married. His wife subsequently developed what is described as psychological disorders. And essentially, Ioann blamed himself for these psychological disorders. He believed that he had committed a sin a crime against God for selling alcohol to poor, naive, foolish Russian peasants, that he had been punished by God with his wife's illness. Thus, Ivan sold his property, his tavern, and began to preach strongly against the consumption of alcohol. And the consumption of alcohol was a social evil and a spiritual sin. Now, he too went to Kronshtadt in the 1890s, staying there from 1893 to 1897, attempting to establish what looks like a sort of a series of religious meetings, informal religious meetings, where basically he and a group of followers would meet and discuss the gospel. During these meetings, Ivan established one of the main reasons why he was an attractive figure. He took the Bible stories and tried to explain the Bible morals, and explain them in simple, down-to-earth terms, in simple, down-to-earth language, that directly related to the material conditions of his audience. This allowed those listening to connect to these Bible stories, to the morals of these stories, in ways they had not done before. In other words, when Ivan made an effort to connect the experiences of his audience to these religious teachings, the audience responded with a great deal of positivity. Now, of course, the problem is that reading the Bible, especially in Russian Orthodoxy, was something generally reserved for priests to do in church. Well, not necessarily reading the Bible, I would probably say interpreting the Bible. Interpreting the Bible was something normally reserved for priests in church. And of course, there were those who believed that his soft-spoken moral lectures on biblical subjects presented a challenge to the church's authority. Unsurprisingly, by the way, that his meetings were most popular, and he as a person was most popular among those individuals who had lost a great deal, either directly or indirectly, through the damage wrought by alcoholism. Often, many of his people attending the meetings were, for instance, the wives of alcoholic husbands whose livelihoods, whose physical health, whose behavior had been destroyed through excessive alcohol, and especially vodka consumption. Now, already in 1897, the Synod had responded, the authorities had responded to Ivan's teachings by expelling him from St. Petersburg. And this was to be the first in several clashes with the authority over his religious activities. In 1900, he went to a monastery. Remember, he was sent to a monastery. Remember, I mentioned how monasteries were often used to imprison religious dissidents. And on this occasion, he was rather fortunate in that a friend of his, a priest, asked Nicholas II himself to intervene in the matter, and Nicholas II secured Churikov's rapid release. Now, from the period from about 1904 all the way until the declaration of the First World War in 1914, Ivan is basically running a variety of anti-alcohol institutions and establishments, trying to get out his basic message. And certainly he develops a large degree of popularity. But finally, in 1914, the Synod, after a lengthy investigation through Ivan out of the Orthodox Church. He was excommunicated. Now, isn't this peculiar? We have a man who's not doing really anything that we could... it's peculiar because there's nothing too objectionable about what Ivan does, is there? I mean, he has assemblies where he preaches against alcohol. The church is heavily engaged against alcohol. And he basically conducts simple moral readings of the New Testament. Of the Bible, I beg your pardon, of the Bible. Ones which he connects, which he makes popular by connecting them directly to the experience of his audience. The problem for the Synod is that all of this is happening beyond its control and beyond its supervision. Chulikov is not a priest, he's not a monk or a bishop. He's not anyone who has any real connection with the church. And the Synod is never really able to establish its control over him. And as such, he is ultimately thrown out of the church. The church cannot tolerate a form of popular religious enthusiasm that runs beyond its control. Here we see the paradox that I mentioned very strongly. The church wants to encourage religious enthusiasm, but it cannot permit this to go beyond some quite narrow borders defining what is acceptable enthusiasm and what isn't. So we come now to our final figure. Also quite notorious, but for different reasons than Ioann of Kronshtadt. So again, the son of a peasant, not a typical background for an Orthodox priest, although it was an increasing phenomenon by the end of the 19th century. Indeed, it was mainly thanks to the opening of the clerical estate in the 1860s that Gapon, with his peasant background, was able to enter into the ecclesiastical seminary in his home province of Poltava, today in Ukraine. Now, initially, he had wanted to pursue a secular education, wanting to go to a university, rather than one of the church's higher institutions. However, his wife persuaded him otherwise, and after his graduation from the seminary, he took clerical, he was ordained as a priest. However, his wife died not long after this event, after several years of him serving as a normal parish priest. And following this event, Georgi Gapon decided to go to St. Petersburg to pursue his further education in one of the church's ecclesiastical academies, in one of its universities. And whilst there, of course, he encountered this new, energized social gospel that had been propounded by Antony Vatkovsky, first when he was the rector of the academy, and still being propounded now he was the metropolitan of St. Petersburg. Unsurprisingly, therefore, Gapon, whose upbringing in the peasantry and then his service in a rural parish in Poltava had conditioned him to strongly sympathize with the poor, the suffering, and the weak. Well, he strongly took to the social gospel and began leading and began taking part in the lecturing, the urban outreach being organized by the Religious Moral Society, the Moral Religious Society in St. Petersburg, and a variety of other institutions. He was a talented speaker. He was certainly an extremely talented speaker. and drew in quite substantial crowds once his reputation began to be established. Thanks to his stay at the Ecclesiastical Academy and his increasing reputation as a preacher, he gained a parish position in St. Petersburg. Quite a promotion from where he was previously, I think, rural Poltava province. So that was an advancement for him thanks to his skills. Antony Vadkovsky certainly recognized that Father Georgi was a valuable asset in the development of the church's urban outreach. And he started to actively support the career of this young priest. Now, in 1902, following the waves of unrest caused by various strikes and union action, the Russian Ministry of Internal Affairs, the Russian Empire's Ministry of Internal Affairs, and its police chief, Zhubatov, concocted a plan. And that plan was to try and tame the Russian working class movement in St. Petersburg by essentially creating a sort of union that was secretly under the control of the police. However, Georgy Gapon seemed an ideal figure to lead this, a priest, after all, who had quite substantial amounts of support among the working classes, who sympathized with their plight. And certainly if he was a priest then, it was generally expected that he would be politically reliable. While unfortunately such expectations were misguided. Because shortly after the Ministry of Internal Affairs created this Association for Russian Factory Workers in 1904, Gapon essentially went rogue. He broke away from his police masters out of his sympathy for the plight of the of the St. Petersburg working class. And he essentially took over this sort of this police-created union and started putting it towards his own purposes. Ones which are certainly not directed in, were certainly not aimed at the goals desired by either the Russian Ministry of Affairs or the Russian police. Under his leadership, the union grew rapidly in size, and especially as discontent increased in the capital over the war with Japan, and ever-declining working conditions. At this point, the church and the police had no longer had any control whatsoever over Gapon. And the result was the infamous Bloody Sunday on the 9th of January 1905, when Gapon led his members of his union bearing icons, crosses, prayers to the gates of the Winter Palace, asking Nicholas to alleviate the material woes, to ask Nicholas II to alleviate the material woes of his people. I give you a quotation here from Father Georgi's petition. "Here, sovereign, are our main needs which we have brought to you. Swear to fulfill them, and you will make Russia happy and glorious, and your name will be imprinted into our hearts and those of our descendants for eternity. But if you do not swear, if you do not answer our prayer, then we will die here on this square in front of your palace. We have nowhere else to go and no need to go. We have only two paths, either to freedom and happiness or to the grave." While Nicholas II wasn't present in the Winter Palace, and the Cossack soldiers decided to oblige the latter of Gapon's two requests by opening fire on the peasant protesters, on the working class and peasant protesters, killing a great number, and thus triggering the general strikes that formed a major part of the First Russian Revolution. As for Gapon, he fled from Russia, was briefly hosted by revolutionaries abroad. He returned to Russia after an amnesty was declared by the October Manifesto, and again started consorting with the police. This time, his former revolutionary associates decided they could not tolerate this betrayal of returning to the police, and so they most likely assassinated him. So what do these three biographies tell us about the Church's urban outreach? What they do show, in the cases of Ioann of Kronshtadt and the case of Georgi Gapon, they do show that the Church was sponsoring new measures, new ways of reaching out to the urban working class. We saw this in Antoni Vadkosi's prized social gospel in the St. Petersburg Ecclesiastical Academy. Although Ioann of Kronshtadt and Georgi Gapon were probably the most notorious priests who were riding on this wave, they were certainly not the only people who were educated in the spirit of outreach to the working class, of establishing particularly new societies, new forms of entertainment that could potentially compete with secular amusements, while also educating the working class about orthodoxy, about evils of alcohol, and hopefully curbing some of their worst moral excesses. However, in all three cases, in the case of Ioann, in the case of Father Georgi, and in the case of Ivan Churikov, we see that the Synod was desperately afraid that these attempts to encourage popular piety would go too far. But these attempts to encourage enthusiasm, piety, religious feelings would end up in consequences that they could not control. And we saw in the case of Ioann of Kronshtadt what happens. Certainly the Ioannici absolutely run out of control. Ioann himself never does, but those people who have taken his cult to its most extreme length and declared that he is God, they end up being thrown out of the Church, because the Church cannot reconcile itself to such a heterodox belief. To some extent, that is understandable. I mean, it's unlikely any church would tolerate someone being declared God as an acceptable belief within their flock. However, this was not the case with Churikov, who, on every sort of term, seems to have been largely acceptable. I mean, all he did was Bible readings in his house, some very basic interpretation of those Bible readings, and anti-alcohol work, which is what the Church was also doing. But the problem with Churikov is that he was somebody who simply was beyond any kind of control or supervision of the Church itself. He was not a priest, a monk, or a bishop. He could not be instructed by the Synod. He could not be easily removed from St. Petersburg if he, or anywhere else if he disobeyed. Basically, the Church had no way of ensuring how he behaved, how he acted, of keeping control over him, in essence. And therefore, despite his the acceptable nature of Ioann Churikov's teachings and actions, he and his followers were also excommunicated from the Russian Orthodox Church. And finally, we have Georgy Gapon, whose outreach to the working classes did indeed confirm the synod's worst fears. That Georgy used his charisma, his passionate preaching, his sympathy with the working classes to gain a leadership position within a working class movement, and then essentially broke away from any control by the secular state or by the synod, and thus his actions then led to the outbreak of the revolution, disrupting the social order that the Orthodox Church so prized. So we see the Church did make efforts to reach out to the urban working classes. Some of these were innovative approaches, led by institutions and individuals. But it was hamstrung by various problems. Its church network was inadequate. Its conceptualization of the working class as a whole was in some ways inadequate. It was struggling to keep up with its limited financial resources and its rather conservative mindset meant it was struggling to keep up with the massive expansion and rapid modernization of the cities. And it was afraid of losing control of movements, which led it to exclude people who might otherwise have been perfectly loyal Orthodox believers, like Chirikov. Now let's return 1 second to our very early thesis, our early arguments about secularization thesis, and the argument that the cities in late Imperial Russia were the sort of flower beds of the atheist thinking, the atheist ideologies that ultimately led to the victory of the Bolsheviks in the revolution. I think we have to take that image. I think I've tried to demonstrate that this is not quite as simple as this. There was a considerable religious atmosphere in St. Petersburg, at least, and I think, judging by my own research in other cities as well, by the beginning of the First World War, that these cities do not represent yet secularized bastions of atheism, but were still populated by a relatively engaged, relatively pious working class, whom the Church, despite many limitations, did try to reach out to. Okay then, ladies and gentlemen, that concludes, I think, our lecture for today. I believe our next lecture will be about women in Orthodoxy. Okay, so if you're a student and you're watching this, I will send you your readings. If not, I hope you enjoyed the lecture, and I'll see you again very soon.